My small corner of the world is quiet, and that is just how I like it. I have my variety of bird friends thanks to living in the bird state of North Carolina, and you can hear the geese, mockingbirds, and owl in this clip. I have my knitting and rocker like the 20-something going on 85 that I am, and I have my coffee, God's generous elixir to mankind. I suppose you could call my life still, slow, quaint even, and that is how I like it. On the other side of the internet, though, things are not so still. Have you heard of the PetiteKnit controversy? If you follow or listen to at least one relatively influential crafting podcast, you've probably heard enough to know there's some weighty discussion going on. In all honesty, I'm new to this discussion because I learned how to knit from books and DVDs borrowed from my local library, and I didn't even know PetiteKnit was anything but a teeny-sized project until roughly 2020. To further disclose my lack of familiarity, I am new to social media in general, and the amount of PetiteKnit projects I've seen knitters make has been, for lack of a better word, staggering. Whether on Instagram or YouTube, feeds are loaded with PetiteKnit, and it seems almost every knitter everywhere that I'm following. And every knitter in the comments section not only has knit at least one of her patterns, but also has something to say about her, whether good or bad. Which leads to the modern day social media knitting controversy. Should you or should you not like PetiteKnit's patterns? Full disclosure here, I do not care for social media drama or fight, so I've not done any research on this since I stay clear of any video or post discussing this, as I prefer my quiet corner free of mindless internet chatter. What I have gathered is that some knitters either dread everything she makes or some praise every pattern in existence. For me, I personally could not care either way. I think it's awesome and a blessing that PetiteKnit can make a business of a craft she loves, including creating her own brand, it seems, from what I understand of all the products on her website. I'm neither for nor against his fashion brand. I'm just a knitter. Here is my position and the sole reason I've made this video, and what you've most likely been anticipating after this wordy preamble. I am against fast fashion trendy knitting. Now, this is a term and a concept that I'll explain in just a few moments, so hold on before you drop a comment. In short, I've noticed that the internet was blowing up with Moby sweaters, and as someone who loves cable knitting and knows how relatively easy they are to make, and who hates fast fashion trendy knitting, I determined to make a Moby sweater myself with no patterns save the math and inspiration of my own head. So let's roll that intro and get on with this video so I can explain what is and what's wrong with fast fashion trendy knitting. My name's Morgan. I'm a knitter and aspiring author living in North Carolina, and on this channel I share my love of spinning yarns with both needles and pens as I knit recreations from modern and historical eras and popular films to tell a story of how the garments are made, all while showcasing the small beauties of North Carolina. I also sometimes share the progress on my upcoming novels, so if any of that sounds like your cup of coffee or tea, I invite you to pause for a moment with me and create some stories, both old and new. Thank you for being here. Let's spend some time together. In order to recreate this pattern, I started, like I do all my recreations, by looking at images of the Moby sweater from every angle I could find and drew up some rough sketches. And let this be your sign that you don't have to be an artist to sketch your knitting designs. I obviously need lots of improvement, but the point is I know what the lines are supposed to mean, and I will reference them when I do my math calculations so I won't have to continually pull up the internet. I also just find sketching relaxing and another way to express my creativity, and who's judging anyways? Well, maybe you. Okay, no judging. I did also look at some videos from some other knitters who have made this and shared on YouTube and whatnot, so anything I reference, again, I'm going to be linking below, whether that's an article or a video or anything. I also found another knitter who was walking through the various stitches of the Moby sweater online, and I referenced this video a lot to give me an idea of how the sweater was shaped and where the various cable patterns began and started when the increases happened, because the original Moby sweater is knit from the top down. First, work the front and back yokes separately, and then you join in the round and knit the rest of the body in the round. I, however, prefer the structure of a seamed sweater, so I decided to knit mine flat, except for the sleeves that I will keep in the round, but I decided to knit mine flat and also from the bottom up. I just find this construction easier for me to work myself and to calculate because I'm very familiar with knitting older patterns, vintage patterns, historical patterns, and that's primarily the technique these older patterns are made in, so I'm just familiar with it. I did really want to make sure I still replicated how the original design looks, which is why I'm spending so much time making my design and looking at every image and video possible so I can accurately represent this sweater. With the cable designs figured out for the front, back, and sleeves, I practiced the lattice stitch real quick as it's a pattern I wasn't that familiar with. And side note, I actually ended up using Kimmy Molkholms. I don't think I'm saying her name correctly. I'm very, very sorry. But I used her tutorial for the lattice pattern because she has a lot of PetiteKnit's patterns and she has a slightly different way of doing the lattice stitch that I preferred. But I will again link below every resource I used to create this pattern in case you're interested. I then made a quick swatch of the different stitches with the yarn I intended to make the sweater with, which was a worsted weight, like the original Moby sweater recommends, and it's a blend of merino wool and alpaca. It feels like butter. If you watched my end of winter vlog that I posted last time, you'll have seen this yarn already and known that I selected this yarn for this project. R.I.P. Joanne. I then did a gauge swatch, the overall pattern repeat, and decided I didn't like the gaping stitches that I was getting from the 6mm needle and switched to a 5mm instead and tried again. Also, I am sorry for the yellow lighting in this section, but I honestly do the majority of my knitting in the evening as that's when I have time for it, so you're getting real life shots here rather than an aesthetic video segment I could set up. I really liked how the stitch pattern was turning out, but when I saw how much yarn got eaten by this swatch alone, I had the very sad realization that I wouldn't have enough of this yarn for this particular project, especially since Joann's is sadly out of business and I can't just buy more skeins, and a mad hunt all over the internet for someone selling this yarn didn't give me any results either. I then opted out for this beige-like DK weight yarn I already had in stash and a sweater's quantity worth. While I wasn't thrilled with this color at all, I figured it was a good stash busting project and I went for it. Since I then knew what yarn weight and size needle I was using, I could then dive into the math to figure out how many stitches I would need. To begin, I first measured the width of each individual stitch pattern to determine how much space or inches each pattern took up. And I'm sorry, but since this design is based off another designer's pattern, I won't be sharing too many details with you, such as how to knit each cable pattern, where to knit or purl specific stitches, and so on, as that would be stealing PetiteKnit's Moby sweater. But I will share with you how I figured out all of this math if you want to try engineering a sweater of your own. Next, I took a sweater I already own that has a drop shoulder construction like the Moby sweater and has a fit I already like, and I measured its width and shoulder and armhole depth so I could knit a similar design. So here's the basic math and the reason I'm grateful my mom emphasized the importance of multiplication tables and what equals X in my lower school years. The Moby sweater is comprised of the lattice pattern flanked by a specific number of specific cables. Because I knew that my desired width measurement for my sweater was 23 inches, I first determined how many inches were in each different cable pattern, as I mentioned earlier, and then I subtracted that grand total from 23 to determine how many inches I had remaining. That meant I only had the moss stitch on either side of the garment to make up for the remaining stitches. So for the sake of easy math, let's say that meant I had 12 inches left of my garment to fill in, so to speak. 12 divided by 2 is 6, so that meant I needed 6 inches worth of moth stitch on either side of the pattern repeat. Using my swatch, I then determined how many stitches I got per inch. And I was getting 3 stitches per inch. That meant that I needed 18 stitches on either side of my pattern repeat for the moth stitch, or a total of 36 stitches of moth stitch. Finally, I added up these 36 stitches to the number of stitches I knew I needed for the pattern repeat, and that gave me my final cast on number of 102 stitches. Because I'm knitting this from the bottom up and beginning with the ribbing, I started with a 4mm needle and a tubular cast on and worked one by one rib for my desired length. I also knew I was going to have to do short rows because that's what the original pattern has, and again, I'm trying to mimic the original Moby sweater as closely as possible. And I've never designed shortened rows myself, and I've only ever really knit them a couple of times because I typically am knitting older patterns, as I mentioned before, not modern patterns. So I wasn't very confident of trying to work top down and trying to figure out how to calculate increases and short rows and all that. So working from the bottom up was also more manageable for me because I knew I could kind of figure out somewhere along the lines how to do short rows from the bottom up. Once I switched to my larger needles to begin the body pattern, I really just wasn't loving this color and knew I'd never wear it, especially since I came across some pink Moby sweaters and knew I had that exact same color in stash. So I switched yet again to another yarn that I had that I'd saved for a different sweater, but I figured why let that yarn just sit there for a future sweater I might not make anyway. I know that I could have completely left out these parts of changing my yarn 3 times in total, but I want to share with you what actually happens when knitting. Everything isn't always instantaneous as social media makes out and this YouTube video itself could suggest. This yarn is actually a sport weight, so that meant I did have to rework my math a little more, but once I did, I was off to the races with this sweater, as the saying goes. I know some people kind of cringe at knitting cables with small needles and yarn, but I actually prefer lighter yarns for cable knitting because then the finished sweater is just as warm, but not as heavy as when you knit it with a thicker needle. Yes, the thicker yarn is faster, but faster is not always better in my opinion. Which leads to the whole reason I made this video and the explanation of my term fast fashion trendy knitting that some of you have probably been waiting for. So as I speed through the tedious process of myself knitting the back, allow me a moment or two to explain and potentially ramble. Once again, let me reiterate that I have nothing against petite knit or knitters who have knit the Moby sweater once or countless of times. What I do see as becoming somewhat self-destructive to the art of knitting is consumerism and the beginnings of fast fashion in a craft that's specifically designed for slow fashion. In the age of the internet, if we see and want something, we click and get that something in seconds. Knitting doesn't obviously lend itself to instant gratification, but more and more patterns are being designed that way. As other knitters before me who feel the same way have mentioned, there was a time when knitting patterns were specifically designed as interesting, something that you couldn't just buy from the store. And even in the Victorian era, when knitting machines became a thing in the Industrial Revolution, we see knitting patterns becoming more and more intricate to show these garments are made by humans and not by machines. Today, though, it seems more and more patterns are becoming simpler and simpler, with extremely basic designs and extremely detailed instructions. And while some may argue it's because knitters are trying to be more inclusive to knitters of all skill levels, I see it more as instant gratification. Because of the easier patterns, knitters can make garments more quickly, and because of social media, knitters are seeing patterns that seem as if every knitter is making and every knitter is wearing, so they too must knit and wear that garment without considering how much money they've spent on patterns already, and if they really need yet another sweater. I love knitting just as much as anyone, and I know how hard it is not to be making something all the time. Trust me, I do. I carry knitting with me everywhere. I'm grateful to have so many knit-worthy people in my life whom I can knit garments for, so something is always on my needles, and this helps me not waste time and yarn on myself alone since I'm knitting for others, which I suppose opens up the hot topic of gift knitting rather than self-knitting, but that's a debate for another day. What I am getting at, I suppose, is there's nothing necessarily wrong with wanting to knit a trendy sweater, so to speak, in and of itself, such as the Moby sweater, because the design is beautiful. But instead of just immediately purchasing yet another pattern and instantly getting the step-by-step instructions for yourself, why not take the time to see if you can design your own sweater that might not be exactly like the one you want, but similar, no doubt. Yes, it will slow you down because then there will be trial and error, such as I've already demonstrated. Yes, it will take longer because you have to do all the math yourself. And yes, it will be more mentally challenging because you'll have to decide for yourself where to put short rows or how many stitches to bind off for the arms and so on. But isn't slow, thoughtful knitting the point of this art? Isn't that why we learned how 2 sticks and a little string can make the most intricate garment that no machine could? And even if a machine could do it, isn't it more meaningful when a pair of human hands spends hours, sometimes months, on one sweater versus that turned out in seconds by a soulless robot? So that's my position, and it's why I knit the Moby sweater and why I made this video, to hopefully inspire you. I don't mean to start any hot debates, but if you have some kind thoughts on this topic, whether you agree or not with me and other knitters, I'd love for you to share them in the comments. Then it was time to do the short row shoulder shaping. I found some very helpful articles online that I'll link below that walked me through the math of how to figure out exactly how many stitches I needed to separate for my shoulders, which is what you saw me doing in the previous clip with the stitch markers. As you can see from these clips, I ended up looking at quite a few YouTube videos on the different methods of short rows because apparently there's quite a few ways to do a short row, and I ended up settling with the OG of knitting Patty Lyon's method of doing shadow wrap short rows. The method was easier for me to grasp, but I will not only link her video but also every other video I checked out for the different style of short rows if you're interested in those too. You can't see it too well in this lighting because, as the article that helped me figure out the math to make short rows mentioned, I left just an inch on the back to do the shoulder shaping, so it doesn't really show too well in this lighting, but here I'm trying to point out the curve, and you really see it better when I'm wearing it later. For the sake of time, we're skipping to the part where I finished the front, and it was here that I realized I made a couple of mistakes. Well, not really mistakes, but differences from the back panel. So for the back panel, as I'm showing here, I originally did a tubular cast on. I didn't do that for the front panel, so the bottom edges look a little bit different. And I also realized that I started my pattern on technically the wrong side of the fabric, so the purl bump is showing on the front where it doesn't do that on the back. By this point though, it didn't bother me. I was not going to rip back all the work to the beginning just to fix these 2 minor mistakes, so to speak, and to be honest, no one notices it when I wear the sweater, and I didn't even realize this until I had the pieces laid up against each other side by side. And, you know, it kind of fits with their theme of showing that this is made by a human and not by a robot or a machine. The front part is lower than the back to help it sit better on the body, as I saw from the pictures of Petite Knit as well as people who were making this sweater. So what I ended up doing, as you see me doing here, is I knit to where I knew I wanted the neck to sit on my body, and then I bound off the lattice stitch portion of the sweater. So the front of the sweater where the lattice stitches sits, those are all the stitches I bound off. What was left on the left side of the sweater on hold, and worked the short row shaping for the right portion of the shoulder. And then when I was done with that, I went back to those stitches I left on hold, worked those short rows, and then I had the fronts and the back complete. Hope that makes sense. It's pretty intuitive when you're actually doing it and when you figured out the math for where to place your short row turns. Again, I don't want to go into too many details since this really isn't my pattern. I'm just making a knockoff version of the pattern for the purposes I mentioned earlier, so I don't want to give away too many steps since this is actually Petite Knit's design. If you can't tell by my smile, I'm super happy with how these short rows turned out since this was my first time, and by the fact that all the hard work I put into making sure the cables lined up at the shoulder turned out. Here you can see I'm pinning on my body with some light bulb stitch markers the places where I want my armholes to begin. Because I didn't do any type of armhole shaping, because I really liked how my football sweater, the Victorian pattern I followed in the previous sweater video, which you can check out here, I didn't do any type of armpit shaping for this sweater. And if you've watched any of my videos before, you'll know that I prefer the old-fashioned way of seaming with a crochet hook. So I used a crochet slip stitch to seam up the sides right up to where I wanted my sleeve to begin. I then evenly picked up stitches around for the sleeves and worked in pattern, this time of course in the round because I'm making this seamless, and then just came the long journey of knitting 2 sleeves in the round. And here it is, my version of the Moby sweater. I am so in love with how this turned out. I'm especially happy with the way the shoulders fit because of the shoulder shaping. Really how, kind of cool this looks, to be honest. I'm not a pink person, as I mentioned before, but I really love how this light color makes the pattern absolutely pop. Sadly, it is now too warm to be wearing this, but I can't wait to pull it back out when the cooler weather comes. I thought it'd be fun to compare my version with other pink ones that I found on Instagram. So here are some knitted Moby sweaters from other knitters who followed the pattern compared with mine. What do you think? How close did I get to making my Moby sweater match the original Moby sweater by PetiteKnit? Let me know in the comments below, and also let me know what you thought of this whole video in general, specifically the theme of slowing down with what I called fast fashion trendy knitting. As I mentioned before, I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you feel so inclined, please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you like content such as this. It's on this channel I do knitting remakes from historical and modern and film. And coming up, I have some Victorian patterns as well as a very popular knitted sweater from a movie. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, again, you're going to want to subscribe so you won't miss any video. Thank you so much for watching, because your time is valuable and I appreciate it that you decided to spend it with me. And until next time, happy knitting and God bless, my friend.
Could you give me a little snore? There you go. See, now you can see the details.
And where did I put my stitch marker? There it is! Yeah, okay. These are always really nice. Always airplanes whenever I'm trying to do this. Just want to get something nice bird sounds in North Carolina. And what do we have to have? An airplane. Well, safe flights to those who are flying, for sure.
Alright, good job.
Do not listen. Safe travels. Wherever you are, wherever you're going. Enjoy.
Get the hair clip.